Welcome to the Commons Classroom, Public Questions, a proto-podcast series from the Commons Archive. This series introduces the ideas behind Ben Eicher's ongoing work on property, power, political economy, history, and the structures that shape everyday life. In this first part, we'll begin with the foundation. Who Ben is, what led him to the project, how philosophy and psychology shaped his thinking, and what he means by the framework: theft, fraud, and force. Theft asks how systems begin. Fraud asks how they justify themselves. Force asks how they maintain themselves. Together, they form a way of understanding how power takes what it wants, explains that taking as legitimate, and then enforces the arrangement as order. Let's begin. Welcome. Thanks for taking the time to sit with us and answer some questions. First, let's start with who you are and what do you actually do?
My name is Ben Eicher. I'm a writer, researcher, and public educator working at the intersection of philosophy, history, political economy, theology, and social criticism. Most of my work tries to explain how systems of power are built, justified, and maintained, especially through property, law, money, and force.
What led you to start working on theft, fraud, and force?
Theft, fraud, and force grew out of a long-standing question I kept returning to. How did the world become organized this way, and why do so many unjust arrangements appear normal? I had studied property theory, especially Locke, and I became increasingly convinced that many systems we call legitimate begin with taking, then explain themselves afterward. The project became my way of tracing that pattern historically and philosophically.
How would you describe your work to someone hearing it for the first time?
My work is an attempt to explain power from the ground up. I look at land, property, law, labor, debt, corporations, and the state, and I ask how these things came to be treated as natural or inevitable. The basic goal is to make visible the structures people live inside but are often not taught to question.
What problem are you trying to solve with your writing?
I'm trying to solve a problem of perception. A lot of people feel that something is wrong, but they are given fragmented explanations. Bad politicians, bad markets, bad individuals, bad luck. My work tries to show the deeper architecture behind those fragments so people can see the system as a system.
Why do you focus on property, power, and political economy?
Because property is one of the central organizing ideas of modern life. It determines who has land, who has shelter, who has access, who has leverage, and who must sell their labor to survive. If you want to understand power, you eventually have to understand property. And if you want to understand property, you understand law, force, and political economy.
What did you study, and how did it shape your thinking?
I studied philosophy and psychology at Youngstown State University. Philosophy gave me the tools to examine concepts like justice, property, legitimacy, and freedom. Psychology helped me think about belief, obedience, trauma, conformity, and how people internalize systems that may be harming them. Together, they pushed me toward both structural analysis and human testimony.
Which thinkers or traditions influenced your work the most?
A lot of traditions shaped me. Anarchist thought, Christian social criticism, political philosophy, labor history, and critiques of capitalism. Locke is central because I argue against his theory of appropriation. Kropotkin, Winstanley, Tolstoy, Graeber, Marx, Chomsky, and Ellen Mixon's Wood all matter in different ways. I'm especially drawn to thinkers who ask whether hierarchy, ownership, and domination are as natural as we are told.
What ideas did you once believe that you've since changed your mind about?
I used to take more of the official story for granted, that property, markets, law, and the state were basically neutral structures, even if imperfect. Over time, I came to see that these institutions are not neutral at all. They carry histories of conquest, enclosure, exclusion, and enforcement. The more I studied, the less convincing the idea of a purely voluntary social order became.
How did your philosophy and psychology background come together in your work?
Philosophy helped me ask whether a system is justified. Psychology helped me ask why people believe it is justified. That combination matters because power does not survive by force alone. It also survives through habit, fear, identity, language, moral narratives, and learned obedience. So my work is both about institutions and about the human mind living inside them.
What is theft, fraud, and force in one sentence?
Theft, fraud, and force is a three-part framework for understanding how power takes what it wants, explains that taking as legitimate, and then enforces the arrangement as law and order.
What are the 3 volumes about?
Volume 1, Theft, is about original taking, conquest, enclosure, dispossession, and the origins of property. Volume 2, Fraud, is about legitimacy, how law, contract, money, corporations, and political theory justify unequal arrangements. Volume 3, Force, is about enforcement, how the state, police, prisons, borders, bureaucracy, and violence preserve the system once it exists.
Why divide it into theft, fraud, and force?
Because those are 3 different moments in the life of power. First, something is taken. Then that taking is renamed, rationalized, and legalized. Finally, the new order is defended against anyone who resists it. Theft explains the origin, fraud explains the justification, and force explains the maintenance.
What does theft mean in your framework?
Theft, in my framework, does not only mean someone stealing an object in the ordinary legal sense. I use it to describe historical dispossession, the taking of land, resources, commons, labor, and life chances. It is about how what once belonged to many becomes controlled by a few, and then later gets treated as rightful ownership.
What does fraud mean in your framework?
Fraud, in my framework, means the story that comes after the taking. It is the production of legitimacy. It includes the legal, philosophical, religious, economic, and political narratives that make domination look like consent, make inequality look deserved, and make historical theft appear lawful.
And what does force mean in your framework?
It is what happens when the story is no longer enough. It includes policing, courts, prisons, borders, armies, eviction, surveillance, and bureaucracy. Force is the final guarantee behind property, contract, debt, and state authority.
Why do you argue that property begins with theft?
Because historically, property rarely begins with peaceful agreement among equals. It often begins with conquest, enclosure, colonization, legal exclusion, or the conversion of shared land into private title. My argument is not that every personal possession is theft, but that major systems of property are built on prior acts of dispossession that later get hidden by law.
What do you mean when you say systems need legitimacy stories?
I mean, a system cannot rely on violence every second of every day. It needs people to believe it is normal, necessary, moral, or inevitable. Legitimacy stories are the narratives that teach people why the existing order is supposedly fair, why the rich deserve wealth, why the poor deserve hardship, why law equals justice, and why obedience equals responsibility.
How does law transform force into something that looks neutral?
Law gives force a costume of procedure. The same act that would look like violence if done by an ordinary person can appear legitimate when performed through a court order, a contract, a badge, or a statute. Law does not eliminate force. It organizes it, authorizes it, and teaches people to see it as order.
What role does the state play in maintaining economic systems?
The state is not just an umpire standing outside the economy. It creates and protects the conditions under which the economy operates. Property rights, contract enforcement, currency, policing, courts, borders, subsidies, bailouts, and corporate privileges. In that sense, markets are not separate from state power. They are deeply dependent on it.
And lastly, what is the relationship between power and consent?
Power often tries to present itself as consent. But consent is complicated when people are born into systems they did not choose, depend on wages to survive, face homelessness or hunger if they refuse, and are told that participation equals agreement. So one of the central questions in my work is whether consent is meaningful when the alternatives are structured by force.
That brings us to the end of part 1 of The Commons Classroom, Public Questions. In this opening conversation, we introduced Ben Eicher's background, the origins of theft, fraud, and force, and the basic framework behind the project. We talked about philosophy, psychology, property, power, legitimacy, law, the state, and consent. The central idea is that power does not simply appear as brute force. It usually moves through a sequence. First, something is taken. Then, that taking is explained, renamed, and justified. Finally, the new arrangement is enforced as law, order, and common sense. That is the basic structure of theft, fraud, and force: taking, justification, and enforcement. This has been The Commons Classroom, Public Questions from the Commons Archive. Until next time, ask who benefits, who pays, who enforces it, and what story makes it seem legitimate.